Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
155 years ago today, the U.S. Army took possession of Galveston Island just off the coast of Texas and began a late-arriving, long-lasting war against slavery in Texas. This little-known battle would endure for months after the end of what we normally think of as the Civil War. This struggle between Texas freed people, loyalists, and the U.S. Army against stubborn defenders of slavery would become the basis for Juneteenth, an African-American holiday celebrating emancipation. The historical origins of Juneteenth are clear. On June 19, 1865, General Order No. 3, as read by U.S. Major General Gordon Granger, said, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that of employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly in their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere." The idea that any such proclamation would still need to be issued in 1865 forces us to rethink how and when slavery and the Civil War really ended. By June 19, 1865, it had been more than 2 years since President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Almost 5 months had passed since Congress passed the 13th Amendment, and more than 2 months since General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate Army at Appomattox Courthouse. So why did Granger need to act to end slavery? Well, to answer that question, we have to look back at slavery, the Civil War, and Texas's peculiar place in both histories. During the Civil War, white Southerners forcibly moved tens of thousands of slaves to Texas, hoping to keep them in bondage and away from the U.S. Army. Even after General Lee surrendered, Confederates dreamed of sustaining the rebel cause in Texas. It was only on June 2nd, 1865, after the state's rebel governor fled to Mexico, did Confederate Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith agree to surrender the state of Texas. For more than 2 weeks, chaos reigned as people looted the state treasury and no one was certain who was in charge. In that chaos, many African Americans fled, some across the river in Mexico, a less remembered pathway to freedom in the decades before the Civil War. Others launched strikes or refused to work. But in a state where whites outnumbered slaves more than 2 to 1, white Southerners did everything in their power to sustain slavery wherever they could. Granger's arrival on June 19th marked the first effective intervention of the United States in Texas on the side of ending slavery. So when Granger issued his proclamation in Galveston, it was no abstract or symbolic statement against slavery and rebellion. No, he was striking a blow against slavery itself in the place where it remained most firmly entrenched in June 1865. But what exactly did Granger's proclamation really mean? One oft-told myth has it that Texans simply did not know that slavery had ended, that Granger brought in his telling good news. But if we listen to the words of Mr. Felix Haywood, a slave in Texas during the Civil War, we see that this was not so. Oh, we knowed what was going on in the war all the time. When they first told us we was free, we all felt like heroes, and nobody had made us that way but ourselves. If Haywood and other enslaved people already knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, what exactly did the events of June 19, 1865 mean? Here we face a key forgotten reality about the end of the Civil War and slavery that has been shrouded in the mythology of Appomattox. The internecine conflict and the institution of slavery could not and did not end neatly at Appomattox or on Galveston Island. Ending slavery was not simply a matter of issuing pronouncements. It was a matter of forcing rebels to obey the law. To a very real extent, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment only amounted to mere promissory notes of freedom. The real on-the-ground work of ending slavery and defending the rudiments of liberty was done by the freed blacks in collaboration with and often backed by the force of the U.S. Army. Granger's proclamation may not have brought a new awareness of emancipation, but it did carry this crucial promise of force. Within a matter of weeks, 50,000 U.S. troops flooded the state of Texas. These soldiers were needed because white Southerners refused to give up on slavery. In October 1865, months after the June 19th proclamation, white Texans in some regions still claimed and controlled slaves as their property. And in 2 or 3 instances, they recently bought and sold them, according to one report. To sustain slavery, some white Southerners systematically murdered African Americans who rebelled against them to try to frighten the rest into submission. Other whites held on to slavery in one form or another until they could legally overturn the Emancipation Proclamation in court. Against this stubborn resistance, the Army turned to force. In a largely forgotten occupation, the Army spread more than 40 outposts across the state of Texas to teach rebels the idea of law as an irresistible power to which all must bow. Freed blacks, as Haywood's quote reminds us, did not need the Army to teach them about freedom. They needed the Army to teach white Southerners the futility of trying to sustain slavery. The U.S. Army acted as if the Civil War never ended. Relying upon its broad war powers to exert control over civilians, the Army attacked slavery in Texas by arresting judges and sheriffs, taking control over court cases, running military commissions, and suspending habeas corpus. As Texas's provisional governor, a white loyalist, tried to build a new state, the Army provided crucial support against the developing insurgency. And slowly, slavery itself ended. By the winter of 1865 through 1866, freed blacks, the Army, and white loyalists had extinguished the peculiar institution in Texas. Under the threat of continued military occupation, President Andrew Johnson coerced former Confederate states into inscribing this change into the Constitution by ratifying the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. But the victory over slavery was only one in a series of battles to determine the meaning of freedom. Over the next few years, the rights of freed Black people and their power expanded, along with the Army's authority to protect them. Responding to white Southerners' efforts to create a hardened racial caste system, the U.S. Congress in 1866 tried to create defensible rights through the 14th Amendment that created birthright citizenship, established equal protection under the law, and guaranteed due process. When rebel states did not accept that amendment, Congress reasserted military control and charged the Army with registering freed Blacks to vote. In 1869, Congress also passed a 15th Amendment prohibiting the denial of the vote on grounds of race or previous conditions of servitude. New biracial governments in the South helped to write both amendments into the Constitution, thus remaking basic rights not just for African Americans, but for all Americans. Reconstruction created a whole new world in Texas. Almost 40,000 Black Texans, mostly former slaves, voted to call the state's new constitutional convention. The new state government in Texas established statewide public schools, protected small homesteads from foreclosure, and created a tri-racial state police. Among the leading Black politicians to emerge were freeborn teacher George T. Ruby and the previously enslaved Matthew Gaines. On the ground, free Blacks built vibrant families, constructed churches, opened schools, and elected African Americans to less remembered but crucial local offices. But unfortunately, these gains did not endure. Over the 1870s, as the Army lost its hold on many rebel states, Democrats reestablished control. Through a poll tax in 1902 and an all-white primary in 1903, African American voter turnout in Texas dropped from 100,000 in the 1890s to fewer than 5,000 by 1906. From General Granger's arrival in Galveston, Texas in 1865, African Americans endured almost 100 years of disenfranchisement and segregation during the Jim Crow era, which legally ended with the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Juneteenth is not just about the day that Granger made his proclamation. It is about the battles that were fought and won to secure our freedom. African Americans in Texas wanted to remember that emancipation and Reconstruction did not come easily. It came with a price. Beginning in 1866, the year after the proclamation, and growing dramatically after an 1867 parade in Austin, Juneteenth festivals spread to towns and churches across Texas. At Houston's aptly named Emancipation Park, African Americans flew flags, sang patriotic songs, paraded in uniform, and defended the memory of Reconstruction. As African Americans moved north and west, Juneteenth moved with them to hundreds of towns and cities. Juneteenth became a way for African Americans to celebrate their gains, sustain their hopes, assess their defeats, and plan paths forward. Now, as we approach the 155th anniversary of the events that ended slavery and constructed meaningful rights for all Americans, we should look to Juneteenth as a model for commemorating Reconstruction. Let us gather together in parks and in programs, in schools and in our places of employment, and not only celebrate the accomplishments of ending slavery and constructing equal rights, but we must also grapple with how Reconstruction was demolished and why equal rights always seem to be just out of our grasp. Juneteenth is more than just commemorating one day on Galveston Island. It is about continuing the fight for justice and equality for all Americans.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom